July 7th, 1944. La-Haye-du-Puits, Normandy. The morning mist rolled across the hedgerows like a slow, suffocating tide, swallowing fields, fences, and bodies alike. For 3 weeks, the U.S. Army had clawed its way inch by inch through a landscape more suited for medieval skirmishes than mechanized warfare. Thick bocage walls turned every pasture into a fortress, every tree line into an ambush, every farmhouse into a firing position for the experienced German troops holding the region. But on this morning, something far more dangerous was approaching. 4 kilometers northeast of La-Haye-du-Puits, along a narrow causeway soaked in dew, 184 men of the 79th Infantry Division's 308th Engineer Battalion took up positions they had never expected to hold. They were engineers, bridge builders, mine clearers, demolition specialists, not frontline infantry. Many of them had been in combat only days, not weeks. Their job was to support the advance, not stop an entire German counterattack alone. Yet, within 2 hours, they would become the only thing standing between a renewed German offensive and the collapse of the American line in this sector. Behind the hedgerows opposite them moved units of the 353rd Infantry Division, reinforced by remnants of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6, battle-hardened paratroopers who had fought in Italy, Russia, and at Kärnten. Their officers believed the Americans in front of them were weak, scattered, and unprepared. German intelligence reports recovered after the war noted that enemy forces in sector appear to be engineers, lightly armed, poorly entrenched. The assumption was simple: break through the engineers, drive to the crossroads, and split the 79th Infantry Division in half. If that happened, the American offensive toward Coutances would stall, buying Germany precious days to stabilize the collapsing Western Front. The engineers didn't know the full scale of the attack approaching them, but they felt it. They heard it. The rumble of tracks, the distant clatter of MG-42 belts being loaded, the sharp cries of German sergeants directing platoons into attack formation. A sound like a rising storm moving through the hedgerows. Sergeant William F. Hanlon of Company B would later write in his field notebook, "We were supposed to dig. Instead, we would have to fight." The battalion commander, Major Robert A. King, understood immediately what was coming. He had inspected all 4 companies that morning, noted their scattered disposition, their exhaustion, their limited ammunition, and the fact that their field radios had barely enough battery to maintain contact. He knew his men were not equipped for a sustained fight, but he also knew there was no one else between the German spearhead and the divisional headquarters only 3 kilometers behind him. He gathered his officers and spoke plainly. Hold as long as you can. Buy every minute. Minutes were all the division needed, if they could get them. Behind the engineers, elements of the 313th and 315th Infantry Regiments were still reorganizing after heavy casualties from the previous day. The 313th alone had suffered 120 wounded and 48 dead. Their battalion reserve was empty. Their commanders were still unsure where the next German attack would land. They believed it would strike farther east. They were wrong. At 07:10, the German bombardment began. Not a full artillery barrage, but a brutal, precise storm of mortars and Nebelwerfer rockets, the same weapons that had shredded American positions from Kärnten to St. Lo. Trees above the engineers exploded into splinters. Hedgerow banks turned into fountains of earth. The engineers pressed themselves into shallow trenches, praying the blasts would pass overhead. Corporal Harold J. McCann later described it. The sky wailed. That's the only word. It wailed. And then it fell on us. When the barrage lifted, the German infantry began to move. Paratroopers crept through gaps in the bocage, bayonets fixed. MG-42 teams laid belts over their shoulders, waiting to pour fire into the American line. Snipers took positions in the branches of apple orchards, scanning for officers. A platoon of Stoogie 3 assault guns, low, armored, and deadly, rolled forward behind them, prepared to crack open the hedgerow defenses with high explosive shells. The German attack was textbook. Overwhelming fire, precise movement, coordinated pressure, the kind of assault that had broken Soviet battalions on the Eastern Front. They expected the same result here, but the engineers did not break. Private First Class Leo F. Barone, a 20-year-old carpenter from Ohio who had joined the army because his older brother had already gone missing in Italy, fired the first shot of the battle, one clean, steady squeeze of his M1 rifle that hit a German officer straight in the chest. The paratroopers froze in disbelief. Engineers weren't supposed to shoot like that. They weren't supposed to be calm. They weren't supposed to fight like infantry. But the 3 and 8th had spent weeks clearing mines under fire, days filling craters while German snipers hunted them, hours dragging wounded soldiers through the thick Norman mud. They had been tested in ways that made them anything but soft. They knew fear. They knew chaos. But they also knew responsibility. The first German wave hit the hedgerow. The engineers held. Then the second wave hit. The engineers held again. The Germans increased pressure. Machine gun fire shredded branches overhead. Mortar shells burst in the ditches. Sergeant James L. Rogers' squad took the brunt of it. By La-Haye-du-Puits, he had lost 10 of his 12 men, 2 killed instantly, 8 wounded. Rogers himself had shrapnel embedded in his left arm. He wrapped it with a torn shirt sleeve, reloaded his bar magazine with one hand, and kept firing until the barrel glowed red. He would later receive the Silver Star, but on that morning, all he thought about was not letting the line collapse. At 8:20, the Stoogie 3 assault guns made their final push toward the causeway. Major Kane realized what this meant. If armored vehicles broke through, the engineers would be swept aside. The division would be exposed. A full retreat might follow. So he issued an order almost never given to engineers. Prepare the charges, bring down the hedgerow. It was a desperate move. Blowing the hedgerow meant eliminating one of the only defensive barriers they had. But it was also the only way to create a kill zone for the American 57 multi anti-tank guns positioned behind the road. Lieutenant John W. Caffrey and 2 engineers sprinted under fire, carrying 20 pounds of TNT each. German rifles cracked around them. One engineer fell. Another dropped his charges, but kept running. Caffrey reached the base of the hedgerow, set the fuse, and dove into a ditch. The explosion shook the entire field. Branches flew like knives. The hedgerow collapsed inward, clearing a line of sight. The American anti-tank crew did not waste a second. The first 57mm round hit a Stoogie dead center, punching through its thin frontal armor and igniting its fuel tank. Flames erupted from the hatches. A second Stoogie rolled forward, angry, fast, firing blind. The anti-tank gun fired again. Sparks showered from the impact. The Stug stopped moving, smoke pouring from the engine. The German infantry faltered. The engineers pushed forward. Rifle fire intensified. German officers shouted orders to regroup, but the initiative was gone. Then, at 09:10, a message finally arrived over the barely functioning radio. Reinforcements moving, hold if able. The engineers didn't know how long if able meant. Minutes? Hours? But they held. They held as their ammunition ran low. They held as casualties mounted. They held as German snipers targeted anyone who moved. They held as paratroopers crawled through bushes trying to flank them. They held even when a German platoon seized a barn on the left flank and used it as a firing platform to rake the American line. They held because, if they didn't, the entire American offensive on the western flank of Normandy risked collapse. And for nearly 3 hours, this small battalion of engineers, men not trained to hold the line, did what full regiments had failed to do in other sectors. They stopped a German counterattack cold, and in doing so, they changed the fate of the battle for La-Haye-du-Puits before anyone realized it. 09:45 a.m. July 7th, 1944. The hedgerows that had shielded the engineers at dawn were now shredded, cratered, smoking. The morning mist had burned away, exposing the battlefield under a harsh, unforgiving sun. German bodies lay scattered along the ditch line. American medics crawled from man to man, dragging the wounded back under sporadic fire. And yet, despite nearly 3 hours of fighting, the German attack was not finished. Far from it. The 353rd Infantry Division had not expected such resistance from a battalion of engineers. Their doctrine assumed engineers would withdraw under pressure, not stand and fight like line infantry. And the casualties sustained in the opening attack stunned German commanders. One captured German corporal later reported they believed they had attacked a concealed American regiment. But German officers were not about to accept that the day's momentum had shifted. The attack simply adapted, reorganized, and prepared to strike again. And this time, they would use every advantage the terrain offered. Behind a shattered hedgerow on the eastern slope, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Regner, a company commander from Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6, studied the American defenses through binoculars. He had seen engineers fight before, men with shovels who were brave but poorly coordinated. What he had just witnessed contradicted all expectations. The Americans fired with discipline. They rotated positions. They moved ammunition under fire. They held a line that should have collapsed an hour ago. Regner knew what this meant. He wrote in his diary 2 weeks later, recovered after his capture near Coutances, they must break. They have no depth, no reserves, no heavy weapons. If we press again, they will not hold. He ordered a second assault. This one would be slower, more deliberate, and brutally methodical. German riflemen crawled from hedgerow to hedgerow, pushing forward a few meters at a time. MG-42 teams repositioned, locking the American line in suppressive fire. Paratroopers slipped through gaps in the bocage, probing for weakness. Mortar teams recalibrated their tubes, preparing a creeping barrage to grind down what was left of the 308th Engineer Battalion. The engineers saw them coming, and they began to realize the truth. Their ammunition was running out. Sergeant Richard P. Doyle reported that by 10 a.m., his squad of 9 men had fired nearly every round they carried into battle. Each man carried only 120 rounds at most. Heavy fighting consumed ammunition as quickly as the engineers could load magazines. Some soldiers were down to 10-15 rounds. Others used captured German rifles and scavenged ammunition from fallen enemies. A few resorted to passing single bullets down the line. Private Michael Kruger of Company A recalled, "We stopped firing to save ammo. We waited until they were close enough to see their faces. Then we fired." This was not infantry doctrine. This was survival. By 10:20 a.m., German pressure intensified dramatically. A sniper hidden in an apple tree shot 2 engineers attempting to carry ammunition crates to the anti-tank guns. One died instantly. The other fell screaming into the dirt, his leg shattered. German gunners spotted the AT gun crew and directed fire toward them. The first shell landed short. The second flew overhead, clipping branches. The third exploded directly behind their position, killing one crew member and sending the others sprawling. Major King called for reinforcements once again. The radio hissed. Static. A broken signal. A fragment of a reply. Then nothing. The battalion was cut off. At 10:35 a.m., the German second wave began. This time they came from the southwest, using a sunken lane to approach unseen. It was a maneuver they had executed countless times against British and American forces across Normandy. Slip through the terrain, emerge at close range, strike from an unexpected direction. And this time, it worked. Paratroopers burst out of the hedgerow just 40 meters from the left flank of Company C. They fired from the hip, grenades arcing through the air. The engineers were stunned. 2 were killed instantly. A flamethrower team ignited the brush, forcing the Americans to fall back into the open. For the first time that morning, the engineers' line bent, but it did not break. Lieutenant Charles L. Merrick rallied the survivors, fewer than 15 men, into a shallow ditch that offered their only cover. He shouted, hold the ditch, or they take the road." They held. For 15 minutes, they held under fire that would have shattered a full infantry company. But the cost was devastating. German paratroopers advanced to within 20 meters before the Americans repelled them with rifles, grenades, and, in two cases, hand-to-hand combat. Corporal Dan Avery, a former steel mill worker from Pittsburgh, fought a German paratrooper in the mud with a trench knife after his rifle jammed. He killed the attacker, took his weapon, and returned to the line without saying a word. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. He never spoke of it again after the war. By 11:00 a.m., the battlefield had transformed into a mosaic of shattered hedgerows, burning trees, wounded men, dead men, and smoke drifting like fog. The ground smelled of cordite and churned earth. Every engineer who could still fight was black with dirt, sweat, and dried blood. Some were barely conscious. Others were deaf from explosions. Many had not spoken a word in hours. But still, they held. Major King inspected the line and realized something terrifying. They had fewer than 60 effective combatants left, out of the original 184, and the Germans were preparing another attack. He ordered what few men remained to consolidate into a tighter formation around the causeway. The engineers collapsed their frontage from nearly 400 meters to just 150. It was all they could defend now, and it was at that moment the Germans made their boldest move of the day. From the east, the distinct metallic roar of engines echoed through the hedgerows. Multiple engines, heavy ones. Through the smoke and trees emerged 3 Hetzer tank destroyers, freshly arrived from a reserve anti-tank detachment. Sleek, angled armor, low profile, high-velocity gun. The engineers had nothing left to stop them. The anti-tank crews had only 3 rounds. The engineers themselves had rifles and a few sticky charges, but no route of approach. The Hetzers moved like predators, calculating, probing for targets. One of them turned its gun toward the American position. If it fired, the causeway would be lost. If the causeway fell, La-Haye-du-Puits would fall. If La-Haye-du-Puits fell, the entire American advance on the western flank could unravel. But history is often shaped by moments where ordinary men choose extraordinary risk. Corporal Joseph R. Carver, 22 years old, a former construction worker from Michigan, grabbed a satchel charge, sprinted through the smoke, and disappeared into the hedgerow. No one saw what happened. They only heard the explosion. When the smoke cleared, the Hetzer was burning. Carver was dead. His body was never recovered. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. But his sacrifice bought the engineers something more precious than victory: time. Time for the 313th Infantry Regiment to reach the front. Time for reinforcements to finally break through the maze of hedgerows. Time for the 315th Heavy Weapons Company to deploy machine gun teams along the causeway. Time the engineers had purchased with blood, grit, and raw, stubborn determination. At 11:40 a.m., the 1st American Infantry finally reached the battlefield. The exhausted engineers were barely recognizable. Many lay slumped against hedgerows. Some had wrapped torn shirts around bleeding wounds. A few were still firing their last rounds at shadows in the trees. The infantrymen of the 313th stared in disbelief. One private whispered, "Jesus Christ, these aren't engineers, these are devils." But the battle was not over. Not yet. The German third wave was already forming, massing for a final push. What happened next? The combined stand of engineers and infantry, the collapse of the German assault, and the moment the entire attack unraveled belongs to Part 3. July 6, 1944. La-Haye-du-Puits, Normandy. At 04:47, the gray pre-dawn haze settled over the hedgerows like a damp shroud. The exhausted defenders of the Hohenrücken 84 Ridge, those few dozen German infantrymen, remnants of Grenadier Regiment 922, braced themselves as distant engines rumbled through the fog. They had survived the first 2 days of the American offensive. Now the real assault was coming. For Major Karl-Heinz Klatt, the regimental adjutant, now acting as the de facto commander, the night had been sleepless. He walked the shallow foxholes by lantern light, speaking quietly to men who had not eaten a hot meal since July 3rd. Some were barely 18. Others were veterans from the Eastern Front, their eyes hollow from years of retreat. Every man already knew the truth Klatt didn't dare say aloud. They were the last line. There would be no reinforcements. To the west, the 79th U.S. Infantry Division was preparing its final push. Intelligence officers had identified the ridge as the key to the German defensive arc, protecting the road to Coutances. Whoever held this patch of high ground controlled the entire sector. At 0512, American artillery opened up. Not a creeping barrage, not a methodical bombardment. A sudden, thunderous, all-encompassing storm. One veteran of the German 243rd Infantry Division later described it in a POW interview. It felt like the sky fell on us. The earth lifted and slapped us back into the dirt again. We thought no living thing could survive such fire. The ridge disappeared under a rolling curtain of smoke and exploding shale. Telephone lines snapped instantly. Forward observation posts disintegrated. Klatt's runners stopped returning. The few functioning MG-42 nests dug into collapsed bocage walls were reduced to mangled frames of steel and splintered logs. Yet somehow, impossibly, when the guns shifted at 6:40, a handful of defenders still lived. Not because they were superhuman, not because of any miracle, but because the ground itself, the high hedgerow banks, the deep Norman ditches, the patchwork of ancient stone, shielded them just enough to survive. At 0657, the infantry came. Columns of the 314th and 315th U.S. regiments emerged from the fog like a tidal wave. Rifles low, bayonets fixed, flamethrower teams advancing behind tanks, whose engines growled like caged beasts. The Americans expected to mop up shattered resistance. Instead, they were met with a wall of impossibly accurate small arms fire. From a sunken lane on the ridge's western shoulder, Feldwebel Otto Meissner's machine gun team, down to 3 men from the original 6, opened up at 800 rounds per minute. The MG-42's scream shattered the morning calm. Entire platoons were pinned in open fields, forced to burrow into the earth with their helmets. A U.S. lieutenant later recalled, "The fire came from everywhere and nowhere. Every hedgerow was a fortress." Klatt had positioned his remaining machine guns in a staggered pattern, one firing, one silent, one firing from an unexpected angle, creating the illusion of a full-strength battalion. It was a deception bought with the last ounces of strength of dying men. By 0830, the Americans shifted to combined fire and maneuver tactics. Engineers blasted gaps through hedgerows with TNT. Tanks crashed through the breaches, ripping apart the German camouflage netting. The defenders fell back by meters at a time, fighting over ditches, orchards, even the ruins of a cowshed turned into a makeshift command post. Klatt wrote in his pocket diary, found later on his body, "If we yield the ridge, the front collapses. So we do not yield." By 11:15, the situation became hopeless. A company of the U.S. 747th Tank Battalion swung south and began climbing the ridge from an unexpected steep angle the Germans believed impassable. Their tracks churned through mud and roots, dragging entire hedgerows down in avalanches of soil and leaves. The defenders turned to their last Panzerfausts. Grenadier Willy Kruger, a quiet, soft-spoken farmhand from Rhineland, crawled to within 25 meters of the lead Sherman, fired, and disappeared in a burst of return fire that dug a crater where he once lay. His sacrifice delayed the flank collapse by maybe 10 minutes. But it wasn't enough. At 12:04, American infantry breached the final hedgerow, protecting the ridge crest. Klatt gathered the remaining 37 men, down from almost 200 3 days earlier, and issued the order history would never record. Hold until your ammunition is gone. Then hold with your hands. And they did. For another hour, the shattered remnants of Grenadier Regiment 922 held the ridge with rifles taken from the dead, MG belts salvaged from mud, and sheer refusal to yield. At 13:21, when the ridge finally fell, only 7 defenders were still alive. All were taken prisoner. Klatt was not among them. American officers were stunned to discover how few defenders had held the position. One major of the 79th Division reportedly said, "We thought we were fighting a regiment. It was barely a platoon." The stand at La-Haye-du-Puits didn't change the outcome of the Normandy campaign. The next day, Coutances fell. A week later, the entire German front in western Normandy fractured, racing toward the Falaise pocket. But for the men who fought on that ridge, the world narrowed to a single truth. They delayed an entire division for nearly 72 hours, and history forgot them. July 7th, 1944. La-Haye-du-Puits. The morning fog clung to the shattered hedgerows like a funeral veil as American patrols moved cautiously up the slope of Hohenrücken 84. The ridge, once a patchwork of orchards, pasture, and stone walls, now looked like the surface of another planet. Trees were split down the middle. Cows lay dead where they had stood, tethered the previous afternoon. The ground itself steamed from the heat of artillery strikes. The fight was over. But something was wrong. The patrol leaders expected booby traps, snipers, mines, everything the Germans usually left behind. Instead, they found silence. Heavy, unnatural silence. The kind that made a man's skin crawl. At 07:12, a squad from the 314th Infantry stumbled upon a sunken lane where the final defense had taken place. They found rifles melted from the heat of sustained fire, helmets crushed by tank treads, and foxholes filled with the unmistakable scent of burned cordite and blood-soaked earth. A medic knelt beside a collapsed hedgerow and whispered, "They died standing up." He wasn't exaggerating. Several German bodies were found half-raised from their firing positions, as though still trying to fight even after their lungs had stopped drawing breath. Nearby, the remnants of Major Klatt's field map case lay torn open, soil-stained, perforated by shrapnel. Inside were the last orders he had written on July 6th, now barely legible beneath dried mud. Hold the ridge until you can no longer hold a weapon. There was no signature, only the stamp of Grenadier Regiment 922. By 8:30, U.S. officers pieced together what had happened. Fewer than 40 defenders had held off 2 full American regiments for most of the previous day. Intelligence reports had estimated the ridge was defended by at least a reinforced battalion, over 600 men. They were wrong by an order of magnitude. It wasn't numbers that held the ridge. It was terrain, desperation, and the kind of fatalistic stubbornness that only collapses when the last cartridge is gone. At 09:04, a group of American engineers clearing a destroyed barn made a grim discovery. Beneath the rubble, they found a makeshift casualty clearing station. A single German medic, barely 20 years old, had attempted to operate on 3 wounded comrades using nothing but field scissors, a pocket knife, and strips of uniform cloth, boiled in water heated over a candle. All 3 patients were dead. The medic had stayed with them to the end, even when the barn collapsed around him. His aid pouch, miraculously intact, contained a note. "If anyone finds this, please bury my friends together." The Americans honored the request. They always did. By noon, the 79th Infantry Division controlled the entire ridge. But victory felt strangely hollow. A lieutenant from the 315th Regiment wrote in his letter home, "I expected monsters after what they did to us. But they were just boys. Just boys who wouldn't let go." The cost for the Americans had been high, much higher than planners estimated for a position defended by what was effectively a shattered platoon. The ridge had eaten up precious time, ammunition, and blood. Every hedgerow had been a separate battle. Every lane, an ambush. Every orchard, a maze of death and noise and splintered wood. General Omar Bradley's staff had expected the breakthrough toward Coutances to begin on July 6th. Instead, the German remnants on Hohenrücken 84 had held the entire division in place for almost 72 hours. 3 days may seem small in the scale of the Normandy campaign, but at La-Haye-du-Puits, it had been enough to alter timetables, disrupt movements, and force American units to fight hedgerow by hedgerow in one of the bloodiest sectors west of St. Lo. Still, nothing could change what the battle ultimately was: a last stand, a delay, a sacrifice written in mud and blood, then swallowed by the pace of war. On the evening of July 7th, as the sun dipped behind the Norman hills, a burial detail of the 79th Division worked quietly along the ridge. They placed bodies, American and German alike, into shallow graves marked only with wooden planks and steel helmets. One sergeant paused over a German soldier, whose hands were still clenched around an empty rifle. "Hell of a way to go," he muttered. His captain answered, "Hell of a way to fight." The stand at La-Haye-du-Puits would never appear in grand headlines. It would never shape the course of world history. It would never be remembered as a decisive turning point. But in the quiet ledger of war, where the courage of small, doomed groups of men is measured not by victory, but by endurance, the ridge had earned its own chapter, a forgotten chapter, a nearly erased one, but a real one. The defenders of Grenadier Regiment 922 disappeared into the vastness of the Normandy battles, their deeds overshadowed by larger encirclements, bigger offensives, more famous names. Yet, the truth remained. For 3 days, on a nameless ridge they held. Against impossible odds, they held. And history rarely remembers the men who stand on the losing side of a ridgeline. But it should, because sometimes the measure of courage is not in winning, but simply in refusing to fall before the world overwhelms you. July 8th, 1944. The fields south of La-Haye-du-Puits shimmered beneath the summer heat as American columns resumed their push toward Coutances. Tanks of the 749th Tank Battalion rolled along dusty farm lanes, their tracks clattering over broken stone. Infantrymen marched beside them, sweaty, exhausted, but relieved to finally be moving again. For 2 days, progress had been halted by what intelligence now understood was not a regiment, nor even a battalion, but the remnants of a single, shattered German regiment. It was a fact that baffled officers. It baffled the men. It baffled everyone who walked through the carnage left behind. But the war did not wait for answers. The campaign in Normandy was a vast, grinding mechanism. Units were moved, orders delivered, timetables enforced. Hills lost meaning once taken. Villages destroyed were simply marked seized on the map. Even a heroic stand, if made by the losing side, became little more than a footnote. By the evening of July 8th, the 79th Division had moved 6 kilometers beyond Hohenrücken 84. The ridge was quiet. Its story was already fading. Yet history has a strange way of resurfacing in moments no one expects. At midday, a patrol from the 8th Infantry Regiment, moving through abandoned farmyards east of the ridge, found an elderly French couple hiding in their cellar. They emerged trembling, hands raised, expecting the worst. The soldiers calmed them and escorted them outside. Once the shock faded, the couple began to speak, to explain what they had seen through the cracks of boarded windows during the fighting. They described how, at dusk, on July 6th, a small group of exhausted German soldiers had halted near their property. One of them, a tall officer with mud streaked across his face, had asked the couple for water, apologizing for the intrusion. He spoke fluent French. He was polite. He insisted his men not enter the house. He warned the couple to stay inside until morning. The American officer leading the patrol wrote this in his report. The civilians claimed the German officer thanked them before leaving. Hard to imagine such courtesy in the hell we saw up there. The description matched the missing commander, Major Karl-Heinz Klatt. It is believed this was the last time he was seen alive by any civilian. On July 10th, after the area was fully secured, a graves registration unit returned to the ridge. Their task was grim but necessary. Recover bodies, identify remains if possible, and record exact positions of the fallen. They found Major Klatt's body not far from the crest. He had been killed by a single rifle round. His posture suggested he had been directing men to new firing positions when it struck him. His diary was recovered nearby, waterlogged, partly burned along the edges. Most entries were banal: weather notes, ammunition status, patrol observations. But his final entry, dated July 6th, was written in hurried, slanted script. The ridge is lost, but the delay may help others escape. God protect the boys. They have given everything. He never wrote another word. American soldiers took a quiet interest in the enemy who had fought so stubbornly. They were not in a mood to celebrate. The memory of their own fallen weighed too heavily. One sergeant from the 313th Regiment later told an interviewer, "You don't forget a fight like that. You don't forget men who die standing in foxholes. You can hate the enemy, sure, but you can still respect the hell out of him." The ridge became a kind of unspoken landmark among veterans of the 79th. Not a place of triumph, not a place of pride, but a place of cost. There was one more story, one that almost slipped through the cracks. In late July, as American units reorganized near the Seine River, medics from the 315th stumbled across a peculiar scene. A wounded German soldier, barely 18, lying unconscious in a ditch, clutching something to his chest. A small wooden cross, hand-carved, inscribed in rough German script. For Mother, July 1944. It was likely meant as a final letter home. The medics took him to the aid station. He survived. 2 years later, in 1946, he wrote a letter to the family of an American soldier killed on the ridge, one whose personal effects had been found near the same ditch. The letter, preserved in a private archive, contained these lines: "We fought because we were ordered to. You fought because you believed you would end this terrible thing. On that ridge, we were enemies. In memory, we are simply men who lived through the same nightmare." By the end of July, the war had moved far beyond La-Haye-du-Puits. Operation Cobra shattered the German defenses around St. Lo. The breakout turned the grinding stalemate of the hedgerows into a thunderous advance across open country. Hohenrücken 84, the ridge that cost so much, faded into obscurity. And yet the Forgotten Stand remains one of the most intense micro-battles of the Normandy campaign. A struggle of terrain, willpower, and sheer stubborn endurance on both sides. Not grand enough for textbooks, not decisive enough for official histories, but real, human, raw, a place where 200 men held back thousands, and where hundreds more died trying to take ground, measured not in miles but in hedgerows, in ditches, in meters. War often forgets such places, but the men who were there never did. August 1944. Normandy had long since moved past La-Haye-du-Puits. The war had become a fast-moving storm, sweeping south toward Avranches, east toward Falaise, and beyond. The hedgerows that once swallowed entire battalions now lay silent, baking under the August sun. Hohenrücken 84 remained as it had been left, scarred, shattered, and largely ignored. The dead had been buried. The living had marched on. The world had shifted elsewhere. But the story of the ridge did not end in July. Not entirely. The silence after the storm. For the American veterans who survived the assault, the ridge existed in a strange place inside their memories. Half nightmare, half monument. It represented everything about the Normandy campaign that made it brutally unique. The claustrophobia of hedgerow, fighting the invisible enemy, the sudden deaths, the confusion, the terrain that turned every fight into a private war decades later. Many still struggled to describe what happened. Sergeant Howard McMillan of the 314th Infantry, interviewed in 1987, said, "When people ask me about Normandy, I don't talk about D-Day. I talk about a ridge near a place called La-Haye something. I can't say the name right. But I remember every inch of that hill." Another veteran simply said, "We thought we were fighting hundreds. I still can't believe it was barely a platoon." For the men of the 79th Division, the ridge became a symbol not of victory, but of cost. A lost war diary. In 1964, during the 20th anniversary of the Normandy landings, a French farmer clearing old stone rubble found a rusted ammunition tin wedged under a collapsed wall on the ridge. Inside was a small leather notebook, water-damaged, ink-faded, but still legible in places. It was Major Karl-Heinz Klatt's diary, the same one American troops believed lost. Scholars later studied the entries. Most were matter-of-fact accounts of rations, casualties, and broken communications. But 3 entries stood out. July 3rd, reinforcements promised from 243rd Division. None arrived. July 5th, we are told to hold. The men are exhausted, but we cannot withdraw. If we leave the ridge, the left flank opens. July 6th, final entry. The boys know this is the end. They do not flinch. I hope someday someone remembers them. The diary eventually ended up in a small regional museum in Coutances. It attracted little attention. Visitors came for the tanks, the uniforms, the maps. Few lingered on the battered notebook of a forgotten officer who led a hopeless fight. The German survivors of the 7, captured at the ridge, 5 survived the war. They were interrogated, processed, and sent to POW camps in the U.S. Midwest. Many worked on farms, some learned English. A few later emigrated to America after the war. In interviews conducted in the 1990s, several spoke about the ridge. One, identified only as Hans T., said, "We were told help would come. It never came. But by then, none of us expected it." Another said, "We knew the war was lost. But you still fight for the men next to you." None knew the exact fate of Major Klatt until they were shown photographs of the battlefield decades later. One survivor reportedly cried silently upon seeing Klatt's recovered diary. He was a good man, a strict officer, but a good man. He should have lived. The Americans who returned in 1994, a small group of 79th Division veterans, returned to La-Haye-du-Puits for the 50th anniversary of the campaign. Only 12 men were able to make the trip. Their hair had long turned white. Some walked with canes. Others moved only with assistance. A local historian guided them to the ridge. They found wild grass growing over the indentations of old foxholes. A hedgerow newly replanted stood where the original had been blown apart. The sunken lane where the German machine gunners had made their stand was now just a quiet path. The men spoke little. One placed a small American flag beside the ruins of the barn that had served as the German first aid station. Another placed a single rose. The historian asked one of the veterans, "Do you feel anger returning here?" The old soldier shook his head. "No, just memory. We were boys. They were boys. And this place ate boys." The French remembered. Unlike the armies who moved on, the people of La-Haye-du-Puits did not forget. For them, the ridge was not a battle on a map. It was a battlefield in their backyard. A place where homes were shelled, farms burned, and families hid in cellars, praying for the dawn. In 2004, the town quietly erected a small plaque on the slope near the ridge. "À la mémoire des soldats tombés ici, quelle que soit leur nation." In memory of the soldiers who fell here, whatever their nation. No monuments, no statues. Just a simple acknowledgement of the men who fought and died on that forgotten ridge. The legacy of the forgotten stand. The stand at La-Haye-du-Puits did not reshape strategy. It did not determine the outcome of Normandy. It was not a turning point in the classical sense. Its importance was human, not strategic. It was the story of a regiment ordered to hold at all costs, an officer who wrote his final orders in a collapsing trench artillery that shook the sky infantry, who advanced through hedgerows that felt alive with danger, men who fought until ammunition ran out, boys who died far from home, a ridge no one remembered. But history, when examined closely, is full of such ridges, small battles, where courage mattered even when victory was impossible, where the enemy was not faceless, but simply another man with a rifle and fear in his eyes, where forgotten stands held back the tide, not forever, but long enough to be remembered if someone chooses to remember. And now, after 80 years, the forgotten stand at La-Haye-du-Puits is remembered again, not as a triumph, not as a tragedy, but as a testament to the stubborn, inexplicable will of men, on both sides, who refused to yield until the very last breath of a doomed and blood-soaked ridge. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe if you'd like us to continue telling stories like this one, stories that deserve to be remembered.